Hey guys, Jay from R's Garage. Today I have an engine that I tore down that's got a variety of problems, and I wanted to go over them with you. Some of them can be avoided and some of them are just the way things go, and we'll discuss both the things that can be avoided and the things that you'll have to deal with when you're overusing parts. So starting from the top down, there's a set of aftermarket billet valve covers, and if you look closely at the gasket, it has split the gasket, and now you have oil leaking down into the spark plug valley, which there is a drain that Toyota engineered, that way it doesn't fill with oil, but you have a performance engine, and the last thing you want to do is have the coils saturated in oil getting misfires, because the misfires are going to cause bigger problems down in the engine. So first things first, if you're going to buy an aftermarket set of valve covers, make sure they can retain a good gasket seal, because it's not a race car, something you're going to be playing with on a regular basis, and you're not always going to be chasing after little problems like this. But if you look down in here, there's a mess of oil. Now we can move on to the buckets. Now the camshaft is a Kelford D cam, chilled cast on a OEM tin coated shim. So this is the factory shim over bucket style bucket. And if you look at the ones that have the scatter spider web, you also have a mark on the cam lobe, but the cam lobes that don't have that spider web going on in the bucket, the cam lobes look pretty nice. So on the exhaust side, there's no real problems, but on the intake side of this engine, you have 6 buckets or so that are pretty beat up. Something that if you're running a lot of RPM, it's probably not a bad idea to pull the cam covers every now and then and just look at the buckets and see how things are living. From there, you have a bit of a rookie mistake. They've put silicone on the outside of the cam seal. It's not necessary, it's not needed. When you put your cap on, there's a small amount of silicone that goes under the cap to seal between the cap and the head, but you don't put silicone between a housing and a seal. It just doesn't help, it doesn't function, doesn't serve any purpose, it just makes for a mess. Another thing is they've silicone the cam bolts in. Now the camshaft is hollow, and what different manufacturers do, some of them will pound a ball in to the end of the camshaft to seal oil, and some will have a threaded plug. And it's not unheard of to have oil coming up out of the camshaft sprocket bolt, but the trick there, just like the factory service manual, is a little bit of blue Loctite, and that will go away. Because again, you're just going to have a bit of a mess on your hands as you service the engine. It's just more cleanup work than it needs to be. Now, for those of you that have never seen a tin-coated shim, this is something that I found in a lot of the Japanese domestic engines I've taken apart. I don't know that there was ever a USDM Toyota engine that had a tin-coated bucket. Maybe someone can answer in the comments. But the wear overall on the valve train is not bad, considering the oil starvation suspect and the amount of RPM being used. So this was pretty neat hack. In the modern time, you'd use a DLC coating, but the majority of the exhaust buckets look just fine. The exhaust cams look just fine. Now the head gasket was leaking back here on number 6 and on number 5 and on number 4 and on number 3. So there's a certain amount of aggressiveness in this engine, and the guy had stated that it had made around 1300 wheel, and there's some pretty curious marks. If you look in the bores, about 30 or 40 degrees before top dead center, if you put the balancer back on and time it, each cylinder has a bit of a stamping down in the bore where it's really grinding that piston into the bore. So this little oval that you have on each cylinder, the engine is being run out of control. And also you can see the stamping from the skirt. It's a slipper skirt piston, so it's not a full round piston. It's a Wiseco asymmetrical. So there's not as much heel or thrust area when you have a asymmetrical or a slipper style skirt. So there's going to be more concentrated load depending on the shape of the piston. And we've talked about that before with the abradable coating, because you can use the full skirt of the piston to stabilize the part if the piston were perfectly shaped. And because nothing's perfect, in a metalworking world, the best thing you can do is use that abradable coating, and as it wears, you'll have a much wider thrust heel to stabilize the piston as it comes up the bore. But the mark that you have in the bore on both sides of the bore, this engine was making around 1300 wheel, and it's being run on pump E85, and it's been my experience that anything over around 1000 wheel, you should probably move to a known grade ethanol, like 1-ethanol or Ignite, where you know exactly what's in the fuel. You're not mixing E98 with 60 octane or another unknown. You know what you have, and the fuel then becomes cheaper than the parts. Now, this engine was going to die regardless down in the bottom end, and we're going to get to that soon, but the head gasket leaking and the abrasions in the bore are just telltale of the engine being run too hard. So as we flip the engine over, we have a host of main bearings that have now closed up. So we have a video here where it's kind of hard to turn the crankshaft. And if you look at the main bearing, it's coming apart and has closed up. So normally you'll see me when I put an engine together, I kind of wiggle the bearing in the saddle. Well, you can see this bearing has play because it's shrunk itself up. It's folding in on itself before it spins. And the majority of the main bearings in this engine are in that condition. So 1 is okay, 2 is going to spin, 3 is going to spin, 4 is going to spin, 5 is stable, 6 is stable, 7 is stable. And if you look in the saddles, you have a ton of abrasion from the cap walking around. So if you look at all these marks in the saddle, the cap was not held down very well. This is probably one of the worst ones I've seen. And if you grab a cap and you try to put it back in the saddle, you can see that the cap, it falls right into the block. There's no interference fit here. The cap is loose in the block. And when I measure this cap compared to a set of the caps that we're selling, this cap is around 6 thousandths narrower. So to fix that, if you wanted to fix it, you would weld up the ends of the cap and you'd grind them flat and you'd fit the cap, which is not unheard of. But again, it's time, and time is money. So you just buy a part that fits in the engine well. And these caps, they're not going to shrink 5 thousandths or 6 thousandths. So these caps were narrow the day that they went into the engine. Now, as far as the mains being spun, this engine had a front sump oil pan, and I'm sure that if the customer had decent data logs, he would see that the oil pressure was dropping under acceleration, because you don't have much oil volume to begin with in a JZ, and if the vehicle has decent traction, that oil goes to the back of the engine away from the pickup, and then you're going to start starving the mains. You're starving the mains, you're starving the rods. If we move into the rod bearings, we have a bunch of bearings that look fairly terrible, but number 6 is actually kind of on the verge of giving up also, and it's been pounded on enough that it's flattened out a bit and it's lost some of its crush too. So this bearing is loose in the shell. There's not much tension as you move it around. Sure, there's oil on the back of the bearing because the engine's been run and oil will migrate there, but the way that the bearing fits down into the cap is not very tight, and you can see that there's damage present on the bearing itself. Piston pins are not bent, which is pretty neat. It's not a bad time to talk about piston to wall clearance. The spec sheet will have a minimum piston to wall clearance. That's the minimum. It doesn't mean you'll run it at the minimum. Most people run them at the minimum because they're quiet there, but there's a consideration to be had when you're setting piston wall clearance that, if the minimum is 3.5 and you're going to be running the engine hard, you may not be wrong at 4.5 or 5 thousandths, and it may make some more noise cold, but in that clearance you'll have hopefully oil available to keep from scrubbing the piston in the bore. And once the engine's up to temp, you're not going to hear that difference. But again, there's minimum clearances. Now, when you deal with like valve lash, it's not up to you to pick what the high side is, because once the lash gets big, it begins to hammer. But in something like a bearing clearance or a piston wall clearance, there's a minimum. The maximum kind of to be determined by how the engine is living. Now, it would have been nice to know what these mains look like when the engine went together, because then you could say, like, did it kill the mains because of the front sump oil pan? Or did it kill the mains because the align bore wasn't done right? Because if the machinist didn't catch the cap being loose in the saddle, how close was he looking? So these are just things that you kind of you go through as you dissect an engine. Another thing that may seem a bit nitpicky is the engine hadn't been in the car for a tremendous amount of time, but you have a fair share of oil residue. So when you're putting your engine together, do-it-yourself silicone at the auto parts store, 7, 10, 12 bucks. OEM silicone, 30, 40 bucks. The OEM silicone is going to hold up for a long time, and these are Japanese engines. They shouldn't leak. It's not something that has a two-piece rear main from the 60s or 70s where it's going to leak a little bit of oil. These engines should be stone dry. So spend a little bit more money on silicone. Don't, whether you're going to use the factory Toyota silicone or a Fuji Bond, whatever you want to reach for, but reach for an OEM quality silicone, because this type of mess doesn't need to be on your car or in your garage. It's easily avoidable. We want to try to, there's so many variables in this game. Let's at least try to minimize the failures we can by taking known good approaches. A known good approach would be OEM silicone where it's supposed to be, not where you think it's a good idea, but just following the service manual and putting a quality sealant where it should be, where you're not going to have oil leaking out of an engine with less than 10,000 miles on it. The crank has some damage, and now we have to explore who can fix the crank in a timely manner and fix it correctly, because you have an engine that has fairly small bearing clearances. If you have your JZ at 2.5 thou on the mains or 3/1000 on the mains, and you have a thou of taper or egg on a journal, you have to take that number or add that number to or from your bearing clearance. So if you have 3/1000 on where the crank is small, but 1.5 thou where the crank is big because the journal is no longer round, you have a problem on your hands. And fortunately, I think the crankshaft can be saved because this is an expensive piece, but crank grinders are not being replaced at a very healthy rate. A lot of these guys are getting old and they're retiring, and there isn't enough guys my age or younger that have come into that line of work. So getting this done in a timely manner will be a bit of an obstacle. Now, the customer wouldn't have known that. He took this engine apart actually because it has blow-by, which you could measure around on the pistons and see how much they've changed shape, because there was a decent amount of rocking going on the board when you just gave them kind of a redneck rock test. But we'll measure those and see what they're like. Any of you guys that are using a front sump oil pan, or you have a 275 drag radial, a car that can make a decent amount of traction, start looking closely at the oil pressure under acceleration and make sure that you don't have any big drops or dips. The longer the engine is floored, the oil pressure will decay over time. But if it's dipping down in the middle of second because the car's got the tires hooked up and it's accelerating the vehicle hard, you're starving the bearings, and you could end up in this position, and you have some pretty nice parts that aren't so nice anymore. So you want to keep an eye on the oil pressure and make sure that you're not damaging the engine, because these types of problems, aside from me critiquing the use of silicone or the way that the main cap fits in the main saddle, this could have been a very nice engine otherwise. It was just oil starved and now it's dead. So you want to keep an eye on your oil pressure, make sure that you're logging it at a fast enough rate, and that you're aware not only as you come off the starting line at the drag strip, but even on the street, that you're not experiencing oil starvation, because it'll smoke the bearings right out of an engine. So taking a look at the piston wall clearance, it's around 4.5 thou, which is what you would use on a part like that. Again, it's a minimum number because as the part expands, it can grow into the cylinder wall and rub. And there are actually some pieces or areas on the piston that are rubbing the cylinder wall, so 4.5 may not be enough for the heat that the engine is seeing. The connecting rod bushings, about four of them, the bushing is now swedged out of the rod. So the top of the piston is being met with excessive force, and it's actually squishing the bushing out of the rod. So on an aluminum rod, you can elongate the small end of the connecting rod, and on a steel rod, you'll just beat that bushing out of it. So, you know, what does the tuning look like in the engine? What octane fuel is being used in the engine? The pistons were around 7 thousandths out of the deck, and it's a flat top, so it's probably nearing 11-to-1 compression, which would be fine with methanol or a high-grade fuel. But if you're just using ethanol, I just don't know that the returns are there to keep creeping up on that compression ratio. You'd rather run a modest compression ratio and have more fun for a longer period of time. Another thing to consider on this engine is it has brass freeze plugs, and this freeze plug on cylinder number 4 has started to work itself up out of the engine block. So you can look and see how it's starting to push itself out. If you're going to use a knock-in freeze plug, I would use an OEM Toyota plug. If you don't believe me, get an OEM Toyota plug and install it into the block, and then install the aftermarket Dorman plug and see how much looser that Dorman plug fits into the block. The factory Toyota freeze plug fits a lot better. So if you're not going to spring for an engine from me with the screw-in freeze plugs and you're going to use a knock-in freeze plug, just use an OEM Toyota one. It's the best case scenario for a knock-in plug. But once this blows out, this car is going to be skating on coolant, and I've done it twice, and I can laugh about it now, but I'm super happy that I didn't crash Jared's car in the process. So not everyone's so lucky. There's been a fair share of people in the community that have crashed their cars once they're skating on coolant. So the knock-in freeze plugs, if you're going to use them, use the OEM plug. It's just a better, tighter fitting tolerance than an aftermarket brass plug. Another thing I noticed when I was taking this engine apart is the crank reluctor. This is the 12-tooth crank reluctor, and you can see someone's welded on it. But it's also fairly bent. It's bent back, and you can see there's a gap between the gear and the reluctor. I'm not sure how they bent it that way, but this thing is not going to go back into service. This is a critical component, and having it bent in any sort of way is not going to help its operation. This tells the ECU where the engine is in rotation, so you don't want to have a compromised reluctor, and this thing has seen some trauma. So if you take a look at the piston pin, you can see that the center area has been working its way into the bushing of the connecting rod, and the outsides of the pin are working their way into the piston as the pin flexes during operation. So this is a heavy pin, 250 wall pin, but it's when you overwork a part with low octane or aggressive tuning, it really doesn't matter how tough it is. The cylinder pressure will be out of control and it will damage parts. So I know that's not a full teardown video, but to be honest with you, I've got a lot going on. There's a lot of engines that are in process here, and Mo's getting busy with selling parts, and to spend hours on it, I just can't. I gotta move forward. But there was definitely some things worth sharing. This is an expensive game we play, and you want to be able to play for the longest period of time for the money that you work hard for. So the small things that are avoidable in this engine, you know, I hope you're able to avoid, and the bigger problems, again, going back into oil pressure and fuel. It doesn't matter who builds the engine if the engine isn't run properly. You can destroy an engine from me just like you can destroy an engine from anyone else if you have low octane fuel, high boost, high timing, and then couple that in with poor oil pressure. You can take a lot of really nice parts and turn them into junk in a very short period of time. So just be mindful with what you're doing and try to have fun. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.